People who have found a dead body, what's the story? I was 21. I woke up around 9:30 or 10. I peeked in my mom's room to say good morning. Her TV was on, but she wasn't there. She liked to use the bathroom in the master bedroom, if it was available, more privacy I guess, and the door to the master was cracked, so I figured, oh, she's in the bathroom, let me take the dogs outside to do their thing. Well, about 10 minutes later I come back inside and she's still not in her room, so I go peek inside the master to see if she's feeling okay. It's dark and I see her asleep on a recliner. So, I call out mom a few times quietly, and then go to nudge her knee and she is ice. Effing cold. I finally look up at her face and realize she's dead and has been for a while, maybe a few hours. Mouth hanging open staring into the nothing, she's completely pale and her lips were blue. It was the most dramatic thing I have ever experienced and it has really effed me up. That woman was my absolute best friend in the entire world. They said, she had a heart attack. It will be 7 years this July, and the thought of seeing her like that, still makes my anxiety skyrocket. If you read this far, thanks. R.I.P. Mama. Found my mom in a similar way, funny enough, at the same age of 21. Got home from work, and went to check on her. Knocked on her door and peeked in, and it looked like she was just sleeping in her bed. So, didn't think anything of it, went to my room, changed, and thought to myself, well, I better check on her again to be sure. So, I went in there, said her name a few times, got a bit closer, and felt her leg, and it was ice cold. Honestly, ever since then I've been cold. Hard for me to be positive about shit when you realize, that's life. Being the youngest of an older family, everyone will be gone and I'll just be sitting here, absolutely alone. Especially since both my brothers are drug users. They'll be gone before me, too. My freshman year of college, right during winter finals, my closest college friend, who liked to prank me, was in his bed, ignoring his alarm. His roommate came to get me, to wake him up. It was a lofted bed. I figured it was a setup. I climbed up there and immediately knew something was horribly wrong, and yelled for someone to call for help. His face is still burned into my mind, over 20 years later. I would describe it as, scared, with his eyes wide open and his mouth agape, as if he were gasping, or trying to scream. His hands gripped his sheets tightly. An hour plus of attempts to revive him, in the dorm hallway, failed. We found out later that, he grew up with heart-related issues, and his aorta tore in his sleep, before his 19th birthday. Before we learned the cause, I barely slept for weeks. I was terrified whatever got him was getting me next, because we spent so much time together. All these years later, and I'm still in loose contact with his family. My wife died suddenly in the shower 3 years ago. No scream, just collapsed. I thought she had dropped a bottle of shampoo, but when I went to check on her, dead. Tried doing chest compressions with EMS on the phone, didn't work. I was beside myself with grief and guilt for 3 days, until the autopsy revealed a tear in her aorta. There was nothing I could have done to save her. I am still traumatized by the suddenness, the unfairness of it all. The fact we didn't even get a minute to say goodbye, and she's just gone. I want to thank the community at r/widowers which supplied me, and many others in the same situation, with grief counseling. Edit, wow. I want to thank everyone for their kind words of sympathy. My wife was 53 at the time, 1 week before her 54th birthday. I had already bought her a bottle of Fancy Sake, to share on her birthday, but I had to raise a glass by myself, to her ashes. The autopsy stated the actual cause of death was hemopericardium, brought on by an aortic dissection. She had been complaining of lower back pain for 2 weeks before she died, because blood was leaking out and pooling in her lower back. We had assumed she might have a kidney stone that was causing the pain. There was nothing that could have been done for her, aside from open heart surgery. Like a lot of you who are commenting, I had no idea people could die so quickly from this. I assumed we die from a long illness, or maybe something quicker, like a car accident. But there would still be time to turn to each other and hold hands, and say I love you, instead of dying alone in a tub. I still ugly cry about it once in a while. Our cats need me, so I power through the despair. Be kind to one another. On my way to work, at 3:30 in the morning, I was carpooling with 2 other guys. We were going through Walcott, Connecticut. Anyone that knows that area, knows there's a lot of woods. Anyway, I noticed brake lights that were illuminated behind some trees, so I pulled over to check it out. It was this red SUV, blasting reggaeton. The driver had his head slumped down, like he was sleeping. I noticed about 20 open beers in the back seat, so we thought he was just drunk. We started to knock on the door, to wake him up, while we waited for the cops to show up. About 5 minutes later a cop car pulls up. Officer goes to the driver's side and turns on his flashlight. The second it turned on, we immediately saw the bullet holes on the side of the driver's side door. In like less than a minute, there was at least 10 cop cars, shutting everything down. My uncle was supposed to take my dad to a doctor's appointment, and never turned up. I went to check, and found him dead, on his living room floor. Do not recommend. Similar story. Grandfather wouldn't answer when mom was calling him to tell him food was ready, it was a holiday, sent me down to go check on him. Found him on the sofa, died in his sleep. We don't celebrate that holiday anymore. Edit, thank you everyone. I do want to clarify, because everyone has given it a positive spin. My grandfather loved a few houses down from us, and he had died overnight. Unfortunately, he was not surrounded by us chattering and celebrating. We were also never big on celebrating Memorial Day in the first place, either, just a slightly more rare dinner, so it didn't kill much of a vibe. This was almost a decade ago. I graduated college, a year later. I wish he could have seen that. I was 8 years old. Came home from school, to find my dad had come home early from work. Went into house, saw a wallet and wedding ring on kitchen table, and found him dead, in my bed, clutching my teddy bear. That was a lot of years ago, but forever crystal clear. Edit, thanks for all the messages. I am traveling abroad, so not able to answer everyone. But realize I left this a bit brief. My dad was an early patient, for quadruple bypass heart surgery. At that time, the 5-year mortality rate was not good. He told a co-worker/best friend he wasn't feeling well, and left work early. We have always assumed he knew what was happening, and got home, removed jewelry and wallet, and passed away. I do have quite a few memories, and lots of people have told me how proud he was of me. I think he went to be close to me and didn't expect me to find him. There is a long, insignificant story behind how I ended up being the one, and not my mom. It definitely sucked for quite a while, but moving and kind of starting over helped. I have great friends and a great family with 3 boys of my own. I was lucky enough to not have to find my father or stepfather when they took their own lives, but I had to help police navigate to the spot my step-dad did it. I did, however, find my grandmother when she passed. We were really close most of my life, and I had moved in with her while I was sobering up and going through a divorce. She had started progressing in her dementia, and honestly taking care of her was exactly what I needed at that moment. I don't know if I could have done it for anyone else, but it was kind of cathartic that I was helping feed the woman who taught me how to use a fork. She was pleasant most of the time, but she'd get scared when she was confused and didn't know where/what was going on, so I'd just have her snuggle up on my shoulder and tell her stories about us in a calm voice until she felt better, remembering how many times she'd done that for me. I'd gotten an opportunity to move and do some dream work in my dream city, so my mother was going to take over caring for her when I moved. I was all packed, had the car loaded and everything when I went to wake her to say goodbye. She was laying on the floor beside the bed. I called out her name and no response. I rushed over to see if I needed to do CPR, and when I laid my hand on her arm she was cold to the touch. I literally Googled what to do when you find grandma dead. Then called the non-emergency line. The police and EMT came to pronounce her, and the coroner's office stopped by. Then the funeral home came to get her. My grandma had given me one last gift on her way out. A chance to finally grieve a natural death after a life very well lived, and the peace of knowing I wasn't leaving her behind. You and me, grandma. You and me. Was out driving one night in college with my ex. We used to just go on long drives together to talk about stuff and get away from the university. We were maybe 45 minutes into the country, under a pitch black sky filled with stars, and came over a hill to see 2 red tail lights off in a field. It was so dark, that was all we could see, until we got closer, and saw it was a car crashed directly into a willow tree, and the driver was all mangled and dead in the driver's seat/partially out the windshield. We called the cops, but since it was in the middle of nowhere, it took a bit to get service, and then a bit longer for them to get out to us. Saddest thing about it was that the driver was a teenager. I came home to find my roommate dead in the bathtub after she intentionally took a lot of epilepsy pills and likely seized in the tub and drowned. That hurt a lot. Edit, this gained a lot more traction than anticipated. Not sure which medication she was on, but we found pages she had printed off with warnings and potential side effects of misuse. She either just fell asleep or seized. Both were listed as side effects of overdosing. My best friend hung himself from the monkey bars in his backyard with a dog leash. I found him hanging there and tried to save him by holding his legs and lifting him up. Vomit all over me, and that smell. I moved to a different state years later, and in high school, I had a teacher who was talking about how one of his students in state I came from died via dog leash hanging. Turned out to be the same kid. My then teacher was the principal of the school my friend attended, and my friend was always in trouble in the principal's office, so they knew each other well. A few years after I graduated, the teacher was arrested for charges of statutory offense and taking indecent liberties with a child. A effing 3-year-old. I still think he had something to do with my friend's Edit, he was 10, I was 8. This is the classic domestic violence story of, man kills woman, because if I can't have her, nobody else will, story. At 14, I woke to find my mother with a shotgun hole in her chest, under the kitchen table, and her murderer outside, under the clothesline, with his brains blown out. The only difference between this and other stories like this is, I am the kid who wasn't murdered with her mother. Edit, some people asked, how was it possible to sleep through a shotgun blast, and well, let's ride this horse a little longer and I will open up more about this, and my recollections. I am old, this happened in the 80s. So, story continued? I don't effing know. I honestly don't. I think my brain protected me. It kept me asleep. But let me tell you what it was like to wake up to that. I woke up at 9 a.m. I know it was 9 a.m. because I looked at the clock and wondered what the F was going on. You see, she was leaving him that morning with me. We were meant to have left at 4 a.m. and I could not understand why I was still there and where was everybody, including 3 inside dogs. So, 2 things: it was 9 a.m. and the house was dead silent just like the movies, not one effing sound, no birds, no sound of life, except me, wandering around the house, with increasing frequency looking for my mother and John, that was his name. I walked past both of them multiple times. I did not see them. At some point, I must have started to panic, because when I noticed the dogs locked up in a downstairs room, I knew something was wrong, very very wrong. It was after that, I am standing in the kitchen and I see a foot, with my mother's furry slipper on it, underneath the kitchen table. I moved the table, and I am sorry to say this, but even after 35 years, this is the first thing I see when I think of my mother, a gaping hole in her chest, and blood coagulated on her glasses. I don't know how long she was laying there. At the same time, I wanted to do something. I knew there was nothing to be done. Then I started looking for John, and that is when I saw him under the clothesline. I went closer to him too, and I remember a hole in his head, but not much more. That was when I called 000, OS 911. Ran out of the house and started screaming for my auntie. We lived in a farm, and she lived on a house not far from us. Then everything sort of gets blank, till the ambulance got there. Dude had just freshly died in a car wreck. Was driving at 11 p.m. to a Waffle House for some damn fine chicken and waffles. I'm about 900 feet driving 80 to the exit off-ramp, when a car flies by me, doing what seemed like at least 100 miles per hour plus. I watched him not slow down enough for the turn, then he started going off the road to the left, overcorrect, then lose control of his car, and drive into a guardrail, full speed. I'm obviously first one to the crash. Dust still hadn't settled from the impact. The car was low enough that the front hood had gone under the rail, and was wedged in between it and the road. As the driver wasn't wearing his seatbelt, his lifeless body was smashed between the steering wheel, dashboard, and the roof of his car. Dude was smashed like a grape. I used my car to block the scene, so first responders could arrive. There was nothing to do, except unwedge his car and collect him. He was pronounced dead on the scene. I watched the news the next night make a small mention of his death, but that was it. Never got his name. The chicken and waffles had no flavor, and I didn't sleep that night at all. Wear your seatbelt, and slow the F down. I went to bring in the mail, after a 2-week vacation, and noticed my neighbor's box was just as full as mine. Bobby was an older man, drunk, fat, poor, and borderline disabled, and most days I'd bring his mail in for him, so he didn't have to get in his car to drive to the box. I grabbed his mail and brought it in his house, Noticed immediately it was just as cold inside as outside. Mid-January, I opened the basement door, and heard the TV and went to his man cave. His couch faced the TV, and the back of the couch faced the stairs, so I couldn't see his face right away. I called for him and then made the mistake of putting my hand on his shoulder to get his attention. Bob was very dead. So dead, he didn't seem to have eyes anymore. My hand kinda mushed down on his shoulder too. Immediately evacuated and called the police. Turns out, he had been dead 3-ish weeks, and if I had checked on him before I left, the morning of my vacation, he might not have died. Awful. I had COVID, the months to this previously, and never got my sense of smell back. Even today I still can't smell, so, I didn't smell him. The cold temps kept bugs from populating on him too, so, I didn't get any warning of it. I was so shook up over it, I didn't do much more than eat, sleep, and work, for a couple of weeks. My boyfriend was a Marine veteran, who served in Afghanistan. I went to go pick up lunch, because he hadn't eaten all day, and just said goodbye to his nana, who was on life support in the hospital. I asked him to come with me. He said he'd rather be alone. I figured he didn't want me to see him grieving, but that he'd put coffee on for us. I got back to his house, smelled the coffee, called his name, then saw that the dog was sitting in the hallway, ears pinned back, and wouldn't move. I looked in the living room and found him on the floor. I thought he was napping. The brain is a hell of a thing. He sometimes slept on the floor, so, instead of noticing the gore, my brain told me he was napping. I told him to get up, lunch was here. He didn't move, or respond. I went closer, and noticed his body was in a weird position, to be comfortable for sleeping. I ran over, saw blood coming from his nose, his eyes wide open and stained yellow. Then I realized, I was inches from kneeling in his brain matter, and shattered skull. He told me, his gun was locked up, told his dad, he didn't even have his gun at the house. F me up forever, and I'll never stop regretting leaving him alone. End Veteran S. Rest in sweetest peace, my Joe. Was laying in bed watching TV, with my GF at the time, and her dad had moved in with us recently. Heard the loudest snoring ever, coming out of his room real early, and we almost went to check on him, but figured he'd just had a long night, and was exhausted. Got up, went throughout the day, breakfast, chores, all the Saturday morning stuff we do. 2 p.m. rolls around, and he still hasn't come out of his room. Had a bad feeling, so I kicked the door in, and found him sitting there, in his underwear, pale bluish, white eyes, and mouth open. Apparently, he'd gone out with some friends, and they gave him some dope, which turned out to be mostly fentanyl. The snoring we heard was a death rattle, and he was already dead before we even went to sleep. In 1999, I woke up and said good morning to my wife, and asked if she wanted a coffee. She did not respond. I went to the kitchen, had breakfast and a coffee. I was getting ready to go to the store, as we needed some provisions, and I went to tell my wife that I would be back in 45 minutes. As I walked through our front door, it dawned on me that she had never slept through me saying anything to her, ever. I went back to our bedroom and touched her arm, and it was ice cold. As she was on her side, I rolled her over, and the side of her face that was on her pillow was black, blue, and red. This was a result of the blood pooling. I called 911, and they advised me to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. I argued that this was unnecessary, as she was quite obviously dead. The 911 operator convinced me otherwise, and I started to give her mouth-to-mouth. I tasted death, as it was the worst tasting event of my life. I knew then that my beautiful wife was dead, and life as I knew it would be forever changed for the worst. The coroner told me that she died from an abscess tooth that broke and entered her bloodstream. She had died about 6 hours earlier, and I never noticed. It will be 24 years on June 16th, and still think about her all the time. I was an apartment manager at a complex that were technically condos, but the guy that developed them had owned a majority for like 20 years. There was this older lady that owned her own unit, and we all knew she was a little off and kept to herself, but we all went out of our way to check on her and see if she needed anything. It was winter time, so the hallways were much cooler than normal. We hadn't seen her for several days, and there was a slight smell starting in the hallway. I knew what it was, so I called the police, and they came out with the fire department. No one would go in, so it was up to me and my boss to open the window and go in. No one knew of any relatives or anything, so I dug through some of her belongings after they took her out, and after a couple days found an old photo with a couple names on it. I was the one that tracked her daughter down and broke the news to her. She hadn't seen her mom for over 20 years, and the mom she knew was seriously mentally ill. I was able to share what I knew about Hiro, how she seemed happy, would let people help her some, and everyone kind of looked out for her. Her daughter said that she remembered her mom keeping all the appliances unplugged, because they would talk to her otherwise. All the appliances were unplugged. So, despite the poor old lady having some mental issues, she ended up finding some peace in the world, living in that unit. It really brought her family a sense of peace also. A few years ago, I saw a body lying face down in the River Clyde. It was early morning, as I was on my way to work, and they had got tangled up in some rocks. Some other people walking along the same path also saw them, and I had to stop them from trying to get down to the body. You could tell from the way the body was bloated that they couldn't be saved, and I phoned the police to come. Was a weird day in work after that. I've found 3. Twice was with my son. The first one, we were exploring the woods down by Percy Priest Lake, and to summarize, I stepped on some marshy leaves that felt different from the others we had been walking on. I was intrigued and realized it was a leg. Guy had been covered in mud and leaves for several days. News was, he was swimming and went missing. Another, we were walking down the sidewalk in an adjacent neighborhood, and an older black male was standing there, in front of a house on the sidewalk, acting nervous. He said, "Hey man, I think he's dead," and he pointed at an elderly man, lying face down in his yard, near his driveway. Whole big emotional drama unfolded before the ambulance arrived. The man's wife was inside, and her husband had left to run an errand, and had an aneurysm and died on the way to his car. The last was a blonde girl, completely naked, behind a sushi restaurant in Nashville, near Murfreesboro Pike and Thompson Lane. I called the cops. They and an ambulance arrived. They were there all of 10 minutes. Nothing like you see on TV. They didn't even seem interested in looking for evidence or bothering to find who killed. Probably are and dumped her there. Worked in an apartment complex of around 100 units. We had warned all the tenants we would be lubricating the locks, and taking the time to fix or change some, as well as other maintenance stuff, for the door and hinges. I was on my last floor. I was dreading one door, as the old man living there liked to chat and he would have been following me in the corridor for the rest of the floor. Knocked a few times, didn't get an answer. I unlocked the door and announced myself, as I tried to get in. I met some resistance. He was an odd guy, who used to do the same job, back in the 50s and 60s, and told me he didn't trust anyone, because of things he saw. So, I assumed he was sleeping and he put a chair behind the door. I closed it and went for the other apartments. Time came for his apartment, last one. Knocked again and still no answer. I knew he left once a day around noon, for his daily shopping. I unlocked the door, announcing myself again, while struggling to open the door. The chair was holding the door pretty well, and I didn't want to damage it, so I pried enough for me to squeeze through. Past the door, it closes behind me, and there was no chair. The guy was dead behind the door. I didn't even check to see if he was hurt. I knew instantly he was gone. Felt like my legs had been swept under me, but I was still standing. I calmly, and I say that, as what I think I looked like, I probably wasn't, called the police to explain I had just found someone dead. The operator asked me to do CPR, went through the steps with me, but I couldn't. I knew he was dead, and probably had been for almost a day. The operator told me the police were on their way. I moved the guy just enough, so I could open the door normally. Some tenant steps out super joyous, "What a lovely day." Me faking a smile. Went down to wait for the police, and showed them where he was. Turns out, he died of old age, or age-related incident, and there was nothing I could have done even if I was there when it happened. Told me, he probably took a shit, got up and died on the spot since he was near the bathroom. I was working alone that day. Boss had left on vacation, and I was the only worker for the week. The co-owner of the building arrived by chance, about 30 minutes into my questioning by the police. Didn't even think to call him. He took care of the rest. I left, walked a bit and got myself a juicy burger. I was traumatized for a few weeks, until we decided to renovate the place, after the legal stuff was over and I faced my fears by going back inside that apartment. There was a terrible accident on the freeway on a holiday weekend. An SUV with a cargo full of cousins was pulled to the side with some sort of mechanical issue. A semi, whose driver was hopped up on meth, hit the back of the SUV. Because none of the kids were seat belted, 2 were thrown out of the vehicle. One landed in the middle of the freeway and was instantly dead. The other was further out, and I found her. Her neck was obviously broken and, how do I say this gracefully, she wasn't in one piece. It was horrible and traumatic, and I'll never forget my 911 call, and the horror of seeing an 8-year-old, like that. I was going to testify, but the driver pleaded out. Gabby and Gracie, were their names.